Luthen Rael has the best monologue in all of Star Wars. But I had a thought, what if you took the monologue about sacrifice and changed it? What if we turned it into a villain's monologue? What if Luthen became a villain? What if we built it around this understanding? It would take on a completely new meaning, and so I wanted to take a look at that. And so what I did here, we'll see a montage come up, and I couldn't get a good James Earl Jones voice for Vader. You know, copyright and robotic emotion kind of made it was a hard stop for making it work, so I left the original audio for that, because it's really, honestly, at this point, it's really hard to hear anyone else other than Stellan Skarsgård's voice for this monologue. So in short, while you're watching this, just imagine if Luthen became a villain, or if this was Anakin's monologue, how would it hit? You know, justifying his own actions. Let's take a look.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there was no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything! Just stay with me, Lonnie. I need all the heroes I can get.
There's always an interesting point in a story where you start to see and understand the perspective of the villain. Tywin Lannister is a great example of this. You know, I don't believe anyone thinks he's a good character, but for a lot of people, he is one of their favorite characters. You know, you can easily see that Tywin believes what he's saying. He believes that what he's doing is right. And the question for today is, given what we know, if Luthen Rael had continued, would he have turned into a villain? You know, is he a villain now? Is Andor simply a story between two factions vying for power? You know, is the rebellion actually, is there a part of the rebellion actually just striving to create their own rival empire? Because if you take it from a strict moral comparison, Luthen and his team are fully ready to kill Cassian and possibly others simply to cover their trail. You know, Mon Mothma's clingy ex-boyfriend is a really great example of this. You know, we just don't feel sorry for him, but they do murder him. You know, Luthen is ready to sacrifice and leave the gore to their own inevitable demise. You know, he's ready to sacrifice everything, as he reminds us, everything for his goal. And so imagine if he succeeded and eventually took the same role in the rebellion, or if he swapped places with Partagaz, you know, at the head of the ISB, the secret police for either the Empire or some new rebellion empire. What would he do differently? Because, and again, we have these two ideals, you know, the rebellion and the empire going forward. And it's not like there isn't a view of the empire as a force for good, a force against chaos and endless bloodshed. I often think of the line from The Mandalorian, you know, mainly because I love Werner Herzog's voice.
The empire improves every system it touches, judged by any metric. Safety, prosperity, trade, opportunity, peace. Compare imperial rule to what is happening now. Look outside. Is the world more peaceful since the revolution?
there are going to be dark consequences after the fall of the Empire. We can always, it's very easy to imagine a world after which the Empire could easily turn into anarchy or war or another empire that could be just as bad, but maybe a little bit more inept. There's no guarantee that the rebellion won't simply result in more war and that the rebellion will succeed in something better. It's a hope, but not a guarantee. And these questions are what make Andor's characters so interesting, is because they are so complex. They skirt this line when it comes to morality. The section where Cassian shoots Skeen at the end of the heist section, we don't really know what Skeen is planning, but we have a feeling. You have this moment, you have an idea, but there's no real way to know because the world is treating this story, is treating the Star Wars world with all of this complexity. We don't know what is the right thing. It feels like shooting him was the right thing, but you might be killing somebody who's about to kill you, or you might be killing an unarmed man who's, twitching. And this is the same thing for Luthen. There's a strong ends justify the means method that kind of guides him throughout his life and all throughout his actions. It's also ironic that, of course, Luthen tells Lonnie that he's sacrificed everything for his goal, and lo and behold, what happens to Lonnie in the end? And we see this stated in his monologue, but it's also in his treatment of everything to go with the Gormans situation. It's a necessary sacrifice. It's a stepping stone. He's constantly moving forward. And what it does for the story, this is what it does for the audience, is two parts. One, because it feels real. Even though we'd consider our own just war and World War II, the Allies did a number of morally questionable things due to desperation. Carpet bombing, all these different things that we did. The atomic bomb, even if you want to throw that in there. All of these things we did, we took the means of our enemy because we were getting close. We were scared that the enemy was going to win, and it was necessary because this is what it means. After that, the plan is always after we win, then we'll rebuild, but this is after victory.
Victory!
And with all of Luthen's moral grayness and questionable lines and morality, there's a question of whether Luthen would turn into Partagaz or some evil, someone like Partagaz if he achieved his goal. After all, you could think Luthen taking all this, listen, we're going to eliminate these people who are inconvenient. Mon Mothma's weird ex-boyfriend or whatever, all these other different, Cassian even, they're really trying to hunt him down because he's a loose end. So we're going to kill him. And that's, who cares if he has a mother? Who cares about anything else? Because if the Empire was overthrown in Luthen's lifetime, as a key member of the rebel faction, he would take control, likely, of the New Republic spy network. You could see this kind of play out, and the question would be, does he act any different? Hunting down Empire sympathizers and does he continue using the weapons of his enemy, which more and more might become his weapons, to take control of all he can, to imprison and eliminate them, set up stops, set up searches, arrest people under suspicious circumstances. And this is what we're juggling. This is what makes Andor such a great show. And one thing I would say is I don't think so. But this is still, this skirting this edge is what makes the story and the characters so interesting. A key clue is that Luthen recognizes that he's using the weapons of his enemies, but he doesn't see them as his weapons. They're not his tool. And I think this is a key distinction here. For the Empire employees, the ISB, they don't really seem to recognize or realize the game at play. They don't realize that they've bought into the Empire's ideology full throttle. There's very little questioning throughout all of these meetings on whether or not what we're doing is right. It's just a question of tactics. It's just, how do we do what we're trying to do? How do we make this happen? The the Emperor's energy plan, how do we make this happen? And there's no question of, should we? It's a beyond, we're way, way beyond that. And Deidre or Partagaz ever stopped and said, hey, is this right? Maybe we should take a different direction. It's never that. And Luthen, you get this idea, he constantly seems to be reevaluating his own views. I think he definitely has this hard-headedness and confidence in his own path, that what he's doing is correct, but there still is this understanding that he has to question his own actions, and he has answers for them. And I think the Empire is just kind of a given. They're marching forward for a single goal in mind, which is control. And it's just everything is built about this. We see this with Dedra, where it feels it's really only at the end of the Gorman massacre, or right at the very beginning when the massacre is about to start, does she begin to, seem to have this question for herself. And even then, it seems only for a moment, because right after that, she's back on the hunt for access. She's back lockstep in line, ready to do what needs to be done for the Empire, in pursuit of control. It's the same, who cares about morality? It's all about tactics. And you could see it where Luthen had a moment in working for the Empire where he gave up. He left the Empire behind. He was a part of the Empire. And what the question, to counteract it, compare this, what would it take for Dedra? Now, apparently a massacre wasn't enough. Apparently Cyril dying wasn't enough. She is a true believer to the end, and a believer in this goal, to where there's not really much time spent worrying about anything other than tactics. There's no question of morality. And there's this weird disconnect and huge distance when it comes to between the decision makers and the real world. Dedra seems at a loss for how to react to the Gorman massacre, even though anyone who was paying attention could see what this was coming and what this meant. Anyone could see what was going on. Anyone in that meeting with Krennic knew what it was coming to, what it was working towards. This is one thing that I think Andor does so well, is it's this banal bureaucratic, boring view of evil, where it comes down all to numbers on a spreadsheet. And this is really cool in how the Empire is portrayed, where it's mostly meetings and bureaucratic processes. And it's like watching Amazon, Apple, or any, giant bank corporate entity or whatever, take your pick of whichever evil one you want, and they take control of an empire. And what do they do? And it's all about, timesheets. It's all about numbers. It's about employees, metrics, KPIs, all these different metrics are, I'm sure, running into reports, into spreadsheets, into databases, into programs, and all of this, comparing all the analytics and everything like that. And this is where you get where there's a strange disconnection with reality that the Empire seems to have, where there's this huge distance between it. And this helps, almost safeguard the rebellion and some of their members and keep them grounded and keep them from crossing certain moral lines, versus where the Empire, they make, with a pin, they'll make an order, and at light years away, planets away, this is what it's doing to people. It's a genocide. It's, a slow stranglehold about the death of a culture, for the eye, and when they're watching all of this happen. And you can really see this play out in the type of people who run the ISB. It's funny to see the casting. I think they did such a good job with the casting, but it's a bunch of nerds. It's all about bean counters. It's this type of people who thrive in an office politics, combing over the numbers, reports, and paperwork and patterns, and the Empire is selecting for this. They're not selecting for people who are going to be loyal to each other. The ISB, they turn on each other in a second. They understand control, and this ideal, this morality of control and this goal of control is what bleeds out to all corners of the Empire. And when you take I look at the human factor, comparing, Luthen and Kleya, Cyril and Dedra, you can see the difference between how their relationships play out. Dedra and Cyril's relationship is, again, built on this control. You can see it in the first interaction between Dedra and Cyril's mother. What is discussed? Control of Cyril. Their relationship is built on this understanding of this is how the world works. And it goes back to this philosophy of the Empire focused around control. This is what it means to love someone. This is what it means to take care of someone. This is the right path forward. And we can see it different between Luthen and Kleya, even though, of course, aside from the obvious, it's much more of a father-daughter aspect. They're almost on equal footing. And it was almost a twist towards the end of season 2 where you realize Axis isn't one person, but two, and she's the other half. She proved it in season 2 with her retrieving the bug, along with finding Luthen in the hospital and tying up loose ends, as it is. Kleya doesn't live as a pawn inside Luthen's game. He trusts her. And when the moment comes, there's an understanding. They're equal. Luthen doesn't control Kleya. She's half of Axis, half of what is making the rebellion work. And this is something I really appreciated the writers for. It's possible it just happened with budget cuts and time constraints, but I really like the fact that Kleya was behind the scenes for the first season. And honestly, I almost think it would have been even better if the first time we see her in action is at the hospital where she's going to get Luthen, going to find Luthen. She's sneaking in. If we skip the whole debug the artifact part, it would make this much more of a twist and revelation for her character, where you could see it where it's coming behind the scenes. She's in the shadow, and she's just as much of a spy and much of an actor, capable as anyone. And again, I see why you would keep the debugging scene. It's a good scene, but the hospital scene is just so good. I would almost lean towards building everything towards just making that as good as possible. To take a larger step back and looking at the prequels again, can you imagine if Tony Gilroy had time and direction to write or make the prequels? I feel like there's a lot that George Lucas was not able to get out of his writing. I think he really does understand story beats, the hero's journey. I think this is what made the original Star Wars such a hit, and even the prequels to a degree. The bones are there. There is an aspect that works. It's just the individual writing, the pulling this out of the characters is what they lack. I think they have the story right, but the lines and the moments and the monologues, all of this around it falls short. And so imagine if a better writer had been able to take it and work, with the monologues and justifications would Anakin have given for his turn to the dark side? Because you can see a lot of the same things that Luthen talks about, Anakin would have embodied. Fighting for justice, what he thinks is right, using the tools of his enemy to build a new empire, build something new that was going to keep what happened to him, to keep the massacres, to keep all of this stuff from happening. And I think it's just missing a bunch of steps. I was going to say a few, but it's missing a bunch of steps. But the prequels aren't really known for this level of acting or writing, probably more the writing aspect from here. And I think that's what lies it short. So let me know what you think. Had Luthen escaped or never been captured, would he have become the villain? Or, would he have split away from the other factions of the rebellion and gone on his own way and started his own rebellion, with Blackjack and everything else? So let me know what you think down below. As always, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Cassidy, and this is Fiction Applied. See you in the next.